Hi, welcome to Dead Air Live. I'm Jean Flanagan of Somerville Producers Group. And tonight, in honor of our 500th show, well, that is by our current counting record. We sort of have a BCAD thing on our show. But we have done, our show's been around for 31 years. Every single Tuesday night, we all get together. We're a different group of people over the course of the years. We change. People join, people leave. The beginning of 31 years ago, Dead Air Live, if there was no live show, it was Dead Air, and that's how our name has been established. And they used to do a show every Tuesday night, and what we've done, probably, I don't know, Charlie would have to tell you, because Charlie Tesh is from about the 28 years ago. He's been with our group, and he, then they started going to every other Tuesday. So every other Tuesday night, we've been presenting a show. It's the oldest running live community access show in the world. And each person that joins us as members drop out just continues the show, and it's far bigger than any one of us. So tonight, what we're gonna do is we're gonna celebrate by the only reason we exist is because community access exists. And it's the formation of PEG, and I have two guests with me tonight. I have Wendy Blom, who's our executive director, and Rika Welsh, who is a former executive director of Malden. So I'm going to start with Wendy, and I want you to tell me a little bit how you got into access, because the whole goal tonight is to talk about community access, where it stands, where it was, where it's going.
Well, how did I get into access? I guess I started actually as a dancer and wanted to do dance videos, and so I went to my local access station, which was in Needham, and wanted to learn how to use cameras and edit dance performances, and just fell in love with the whole medium and decided I wanted to actually talk and not just dance, and so I went and got my master's degree in communications at Emerson. And then I freelanced in the Boston market and commercial market for about 5 years, and then got my first job as the community programming director in Lowell at the Lowell Access. And then from there moved to Boston for a couple years, and now I'm here as the executive director of SCAT.
At Somerville.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And Rika, were the former director at Malden, and currently you're consulting, so you're not hired in a particular status right now.
No.
But how do you get into access?
Well, I got involved actually about 35 years ago. I'm one of the founding, beginning, pioneer, whatever you want to use as a term, back in the late 60s and 70s when the Portapack, which was the first portable equipment, was available. And we were a group that were looking at how technology could be used for social change. I worked on a project called the Boston Media Project, which was a Ford Foundation grant looking at desegregation, for example, in 75 and 76. And the group of us were really brought together by George Stoney, who is the father, or actually the grandfather, I suppose now, of public access, and he put together a group of people through NYU that were called at the Alternate Media Center, that were called the founders of actually the NFLCP, which is now the Alliance for Community Media. So we started back in those early 70 years looking at how to use technology to further the voices of various different aspects of activism in the country. There was the reaction to the Vietnam War. There were all kinds of housing issues, water issues, whatever. And we felt that by creating channels, using technology to further discussion around issues would be a very viable way to support across the board activism in communities. What's come out of that has been the growth of public access, which was really actually solidified when the Communications Act, which had been in place since 1933 for radio, and then it kind of got modified when TV came on, because it was viewed as, TV is just radio with pictures. But when cable started to come across this country, What we wanted to do was make sure that things didn't just get given away like the airwaves were given away, and we wanted to make sure that there would be some set-asides because cable used public rights of way, public property, that there would be a return to the community whose public streets are being used to deliver this service. They would come back in the common interest, in the public interest. And so that is how formally, really, public access developed, because that's the funding mechanism, the channel allocation, the money for the capital, the money to create a center like this is all really based in the 1984 Cable Act. And then I think tonight we'll be looking at how that's been modified and in fact how that is being threatened right now.
Right now, right.
But that's where I've been involved from the very beginning.
Oh, very good. Well, good. We're glad to have you
So
with
it's
us.
a real honor to be on the oldest standing show. And this is a show that I've used as an example over and over again in many different times when I've been working on things, because it is a perfect example of public access. And as you said, people come, people go. Often rarely is there a Charlie Tesh who stays with it for 28 years, but
Right.
often there is always a core group of people who
Yeah.
keep something like this going. And so SCAT should feel, very honored and has been honored for having the oldest and longest
Right.
standing access show.
Well, I actually was on a panel to talk about long-running access shows at a media event in Malden a couple of years ago. And what was surprising to me, because I didn't understand, was that our format, which is that we have anywhere from 8 to 12 people, because it really takes 8 people to put a show on. And so we try to keep that level of membership pretty consistent. And we all trade jobs. Different people host, different people edit and direct, different people do cameras, do lighting. We try to learn all the tasks. And we'll get into the whole transition into digital, which we've really been doing all summer and fall. And our whole group is trying to get up to speed on how to use our brand new control room. And it just takes a long time.
This show is an example of how we started Access.
Right.
We started Access by getting people involved as community groups. There might be a group that would do a show around seniors, but the whole essence of the way in which an access center used to be run was to empower people to come together as producing groups, so that when someone needs to leave town or go to school or is tired or is worn out, burned out, or so forth, you have that ever changing and
Right.
And it's a place for people who've taken classes to come in and work and actually get their hands on and learn all of the facets of doing a
Yeah,
program.
and the voice continues.
And that always makes it stand longer than,
Yes.
than individuals burn out
Right.
if they don't
Right.
have that.
No, I was just going to say it's very important that everybody gets to try the different roles so that when one director leaves, another's there to fill in the place. And also to understand that in Access, you don't have to be a perfectionist. You can make some mistakes and keep going. And we always learn every single show. Gets
Yeah,
better.
every show. It's different every time.
Different every time.
Well, I want to start with the first show, the first roll-in that we have, which is a tape from 1990 called Then and Now. And the show was done at the first deregulation of rates of cable. And we have the director of the Massachusetts Cable Commission is speaking about what he believes will be the changes and what the communities still can bargain with if they don't have any rate regulation. So let's go to that tape.
One of the most important areas, of course, is service area. There are probably more complaints in a community naturally from people who don't get cable than from people who do get cable, because if they're outside the service area, then they are left out of, they do not receive the substantial benefits that a cable system can provide. First is who gets cable, what is the service area? That is not specified. There are no universal service or line extension criteria in either the federal law or in state law. So that's completely a function of local negotiation. channel capacity. We have systems with 15 channels, old systems in the western part of the state. We have modern systems coming online with an average of 55 channels. And since program diversity is the fundamental First Amendment value and goal and information, just the negotiation of channel capacity, of course, can be crucial. Local programming, educational channels, governmental channels, public access channels, consumer protection provisions, administration of the license. There's a very whole spectrum. We probably don't have time to get into all of them. Yeah. The Commission crisscrosses the state as much as it can, meeting with renewal communities. We've met with Paul and Jerry Field and George Wood from Somerville several occasions to share information about license renewal. And we're available, our doors open to meet with renewal communities to provide technical assistance.
I have a question for Paul. It's about 20 months now, I guess, you have to negotiate this new contract. Can you explain for the viewers just what the process is that the city will have to go through from here to figure out what that license will look like in '92?
Sure. Basically, to backtrack a little, for the past 10 months or so, we've overviewed the current license, which, as you said, was signed in 1982. And we are at a point now where we're scheduling ascertainment hearings, and those are hopefully going to happen sometime this year. And those are public hearings to take the input from the community on specific issues like technologies that are emerging for cable systems, access, which is a big issue obviously here in Somerville, and other concerns as consumer complaints and anything that we can take in to help us develop a better license for Somerville for the foreseeable future.
And once you've held those hearings, you'll be negotiating with the company at the same time, or
well,
what happens?
The basic in the formal process, basically we'll go through the ascertainment hearings and then request an RFP from the vendor, which in this case is Warner Cable Communications.
And that's a request for proposal, so you'll ask them to come up with what they propose they'll do for the city.
Sure, and all the while we'll be developing our own line of thinking in terms of what we'd like for a license for the city.
And then what happens at the end of this process, for example, if you decide you don't like what Warner has offered you? What happens if the city decides not to go with Warner? Is that possible?
Sure, it's possible, and we're pursuing every single option we have, including other vendors, but it's a very difficult option to undertake under the current federal laws. To have a single vendor is basically the standard in the industry, and Warner has basically a monopoly on cable television in Somerville and most of its other communities. They're a single operator.
Close the door, Alyssa. Hi. Welcome back. So we have the 1990, which was a big change because now the rates, the cable companies got to set rates. And that left us with, well, how can the communities actually negotiate with these companies if we can't negotiate rates? Do you want to comment on that, Wendy?
Well, there's so many other things that the city can negotiate on. Of course, we hope that rates will stay as low as they can for consumers, but there are other things to talk about. For example, how many channels will a city get to use for its community? Should all of the schools and the libraries be wired so that there can be two-way communications between the schools, not just getting cable in, but also being able to send cable out? It's called the iNet, or the institutional network. And cable companies can be asked to wire public buildings in that way. Or parks. Say you have a concert series happening in an outdoor park, you can ask the cable company to wire the park so that you can cablecast it live. Okay. And also the amount of money that the cable company will give to the town to provide communication needs for the town. And every town is a little different in what it needs, but that's all part of the negotiations.
Okay. And Rika, do you have any
Well,
other?
that's really what I do, is I, at this point, go to communities and help them to understand what the process is, which is laid out in that 1984 Cable Act. In the 1992, we're talking about 1990, but it was in preparation for legislation that actually then finally came into being in 1992, okay, which really actually deregulated. Up until then, a cable company had to come to the Board of Selectmen, and the rates were, if you can remember perhaps, $7.25 for basic, $9.50 for
Those
something.
days are gone.
Those days went
Yeah.
with that piece of legislation that opened up that door and many other things that happened in the '92 Cable Act. But Wendy's correct that the essence of what a community can negotiate for is really, the whole concept is that these corporations are growing in terms of what they can provide using the wire that goes from their head end into people's homes. And that wire is on public property. So the concept is that there is a grant that is defined in this federal legislation
Because they
that
have to
comes
dig
back
up
to the
your
community.
roads in order to
Or they run it
exist.
down poles and they cut across your landscape, or you've got all of that wire that hangs around the streets and byways of communities. They're using public property to deliver cable services to you. So the '84 Cable Act, and up until now, up until the legislation we'll be talking about, has always deemed that there should be a return for, a rent for the use. And who oversees public property but city halls? So it's the city hall that negotiates with the cable company, gives them a contract to use those public rights of way. And usually they're about 10 years in length, these contracts. They vary, and it's a negotiated item. But so a city is really giving away public property for a period of time for a corporation to use. And so in the regulation that exists has been, you must provide so many channels to the community, you must provide up to 5% of gross revenues, and this will be important when we talk about the legislation that's coming down the pike now. Up to 5% of gross revenues. You can negotiate for capital for equipment. You can negotiate for an INET, where it saves community costs for delivering services. An INET can be established, and then of course the channels that are set aside. So it's capital, overhead, channels, and connectivity. And all of those things have been a vital underpinning to the community media centers that we now see in place.
And what's the bargaining chip? I mean, they do or don't
They
have
need to have
access.
permission. The cable operator has to have permission from the city to use public property. The city sits in the kingpin seat, theoretically.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. There's a whole process in place by which there is a whole mode of preparation. I think that Paul Train was talking about the kind of community needs assessment, because the hinge-pin of all of these resources has been that the Congress, in its wisdom in 1984, said that a cable operator needs to be responsive to the present and future needs and interests of the community it goes into. So you go out, you find out the needs and interests, you have an organization like SCAT that's been around for a long time, those needs and interests are established, or if you're just coming in to Wire City for the first time, which is no longer the case because the country is completely wired, you would still go out and see what kind of needs there are for telecommunications resources. And that would be the package that would be the rent for using public property.
Okay.
That's the key.
And in the beginning, there were lots of different cable companies that all wanted to get into the towns, and so they were competing against each other, saying, oh, well, I'll provide you with 2 studios, or no, I'll provide you with 3 studios, trying to get the monopoly, because the rule was only one cable company in a town, because they were so disruptive when they were laying the lines.
Well, there was never any rule that said, that because it has always been a part of the law that there could be no non-exclusive, there could never be an exclusive contract given. But the reality, the economic reality of a cable system that costs millions of dollars to build, they just didn't overbuild each other. So once a contract was let, it was given as, for the investment that was put into building the system, it would take them X number of years to realize profit. And that was one of the reasons why they wanted to deregulate prices, so that they could raise prices, because it was seen that once a cable operator was in a community, it was a de facto monopoly. It was never a legal monopoly. And in fact, when we started to see other services coming along that wire, like access to high-speed broadband services, or in 1996, telephony was allowed. So cable operators could enter into the telephone business, which has really led us to where we are today. you started to see 3 businesses going down those wires and made it very lucrative to use those wires. So the leverage that the cities and towns have is that the cable operators have needed permission. They must have a contract with the city to use that public property.
Okay.
That's the key underpinning piece of it.
Yeah.
And it's become ever so more valuable. Properties become more valuable. The amount of money that they make using those wires has tripled.
Right. Right.
And yet we seem to be back away from what we're getting.
Yeah, I
what
guess
communities
part
are
of it
getting.
is as there's more public demand that they get these things, it seems like there's less, the city has less leverage.
Well, we're going to have a
because-
lot less leverage if
Yeah.
the
So
Cable Act
let's
gets modified again.
let's talk about the new regulation that's coming in. It's a federal bill.
It's a federal bill. It was really brought about because Verizon and SBC, the largest phone companies, certainly understood that the cable companies were now providing high-speed internet and telephone and cable television, and in order to compete, the telephone companies feel that they should be able to also transmit television through their wires, which are going into many people's homes, providing DSL and also telephone, Verizon and SBC. And they are not used to having to negotiate with every town. They're used to being a telephone company, and telephone companies can go everywhere and are encouraged to go everywhere and wire everything.
Right.
But now that they want to provide cable television, they're being forced to negotiate with every town, and they're saying, hey, we don't want to do this, even though the cable companies have to do it, and they're making a lot of profit. It's not really something that you can say, well, they can't make a profit if they have to do that. It's not true. But that's what they're trying to do, make it easier for the telephone company to come in. And this bill is really for the telephone company to get into cable.
telephone company,
It's
okay.
written for the company.
Right.
It's a giveaway to the telephone companies. But the reason you need to kind of understand this is that, I mean, one of the things that needs to be understood about this is that there used to be a very distinct difference between a cable company and a telephone company.
Right.
Telephone companies built their systems with twisted pair wires because all they had to do was send down voice messages, just little bits of digital information went back and forth
That
over
alternated
those
it,
wires,
yeah.
right? Whereas the cable companies built systems on coax cable and then moved into fiber optics, and because they were sending big chunks of information down those wires. Well, with fiber optics and the decrease in price in fiber optics and the technology changes, really there isn't a lot of difference between a telephone company today and a cable in terms of their plant. So, quite frankly, the regulation we have known has been not working well, and we could see that there's going to come a day when, they're apples and apples. They aren't apples and oranges anymore. So there's definitely a need for policy change. But what we're seeing in the policy change is a huge giveaway, as Wendy has expressed. I mean, the telephone companies have been lobbying Congress for the last number of years because they don't want to have to go community to community. They've never had to. They've been regionalized. They've operated under a different. There's a whole reason why they've operated under a different set of rules than cable
yeah.
operators
Yeah.
have. But they don't want to have to come to each community and negotiate for the use of that public way. They want to have a federal level mandate to be able to do it. Now, that's a huge brushstroke in what I'm saying, but basically they want to narrow the window. The Cable Act and the way in which cable has been managed really actually provided for a 3-year window to work on these renewals, to go to the community, to ask, to look at how the media center's been running, to put together the package that negotiates for these set-asides for the community.
Right.
The telephone company hasn't had any of that. And so they are lobbying very strongly, in our case, both on a state level and in this large bill that is looming, to do that in 90 days. Well, in 90 days, you don't really craft a very meaningful contract when you're talking about a multi-million-dollar contract. Because
right.
if you take a cable contract and you multiply the income of that contract by 10 years, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. It's probably the largest contract most communities negotiate.
Yeah. And I was part of SCAT when we negotiated our Time Warner community, because we are actually, our community in Somerville, we actually have 2 cable companies. So we actually every 5 years negotiate with a different cable company. And so, which provides an interesting variation on it. But in reviewing all these tapes, one of the things that Bill talked about was the overbuild issue. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's in a later tape. And it's not one of the things we showed, but that by having a cable company come in, you also splitting the revenues.
Right.
So
it's not like the revenues go up because it's like
Right.
you have a CVS
There's still-
and you have a Walmart. Walmart comes in. It's not like people get sicker and spend more money on franchise on their prescriptions. It's they either go here or they go here. Your
Yeah, dividing it.
your
You're spreading it
discretionary
across
money more or less stays the same.
Right, right.
The thing that promoted, as I started to say before, these overbills was because the businesses became so much lucrative enough to support 2 cable companies because you were adding broadband business and telephony to it.
Right.
They weren't just your, I'm going to get more TV.
yeah.
Now they became 3 businesses. So you could start to see overbills. Much of that has died down because of lack of availability of capital and various different kinds of things that went on within the cable industry side of these things. But we saw a large amount of overbuilding and that kind of interest in the late 90s because of the interest really driven much more by broadband access than need for more cable TV.
So what's the bill going to give us?
The bill is going to radically shift.
What does the bill say?
The bill has a lot of different elements to it, but when we're looking at the PEG access side of the pieces, and there are a couple of other things that we should probably touch upon.
Okay.
You might want
at
to
some
mention,
point,
when
but
you say PEG access,
public education and government access.
those are the 3 different types of community media that are in a city.
Yeah,
Right.
it was
We have
designated
3
as
channels in
right.
Somerville. Yeah.
It was designated in the '84 cable. We used to just refer to it as public access. It was just the idea of the public using community, other people, other than broadcasters, so satellite services using the cable system. In 1984, they were defined as public education and government. So there would be a channel for the government. That would be your city council meetings, your school committee meetings. You would have a channel that would be used by the school system for various different things that they might want to be doing. And then everything else fell under the public. So it's nonprofit uses, individuals coming in and making programs, community involvement, a lot of times campaign forums, things like that involved a lot of different people would fall under the public. And that 5% of gross revenues was to fund all of them.
Right. So the city's negotiating those 3 channels.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's 3 channels, sometimes it's not, but those were the areas that
Right.
were to be seen represented.
So the bill actually throws away all those negotiations that you're talking about and says that cities don't have the right to negotiate with the telephone company. That the bill says that there'd be a national franchise and it would be the same for every community across the country, and they would have to accept this franchise. And what
National franchise.
a national franchise, take what they gave, and it says that all communities are to be treated the same, which in communities here in Massachusetts, especially Somerville, which has a very active public access, we stand to lose quite a bit.
Essentially, by setting up a national franchise, there's a little bit of a mechanism where a Verizon could come, and if in that 90 days they don't get it, then they go to the national. There's some provision for if a cable operator already has a contract, when they go to renew it, it would go to this. I mean, there's some interesting kinds of things, if you want to get really technical about it, are important to kind of know. But the main thing is take away from local communities any kind of underpinning regulation that says your public streets and byways will bring X, Y, Z back to your community, depending upon what their needs and interests are, and places it on a national level where, again, they keep the 5% of gross revenues, or up to the 5% of gross revenues, but that can go into the general fund, and only 1% of gross revenues would go designated for access. So many of the centers, especially in Massachusetts, get 3 or 4 or 5% of those gross revenues. Well, they're not taking all the money away from the cities and towns because they would probably have an uproar about that. They're actually, from the city and town's point of view, making it to some extent easier because they don't have to haggle. They are going to get 5%. So for us in PEG Access, we don't have the cities on our side to some extent because they're going to get their money. The question is it going to be allocated to this use?
To this use.
And we'll compete with fire engines and teachers and various other things. And so that's one thing. If you have a very well-established center like this that's been working with the city for a long time, chances are you will still get some of that money, and you will get 1% of the gross revenues because that's going to be allocated. But in many places, certainly there'll be no startup because that's gone. I mean, you're probably not going to see an expansion. What you're going to see is a lot of centers like this closing up, and because they can't have on 1% of gross revenues.
And also, there's nothing allocated for capital. When we start a new franchise every 10 years, the city of Somerville has gotten a big infusion of money to pay for the cameras, the studio, to upgrade equipment over the 10 years. And that is not allowed in this bill. And so there won't be any money for new equipment. Unless the city decides to, and we hope that it does, continue to use all 6% for its communication needs and allocates that 1% for capital, which is a possibility, but there's a lot of competition for city dollars.
Yeah, and as the state gives us less city dollars coming directly from the state, the cities
and
clearly...
in communities that are hurting desperately for money for basic services, oftentimes community access is seen as one of the things that are on the top of the list of the budgetary considerations.
Very much, very much. I want to go now to our next tape. And this is actually a tape of former Mayor Brune, a former Somerville mayor. And he is actually talking to the Portuguese community. This tape is from 1995. And it was the Portuguese community trying to get this isn't about public access specifically, but they were trying to get a channel that ran Portuguese television, which was being sent out by the Portuguese government for free, and trying to get them to put a channel on to cable, the cable company. And so Mayor Brune is talking to them about just trying to work with such a large government. So let's go to that tape.
So thank you for that segue. Let's go look at Jean Brune speaking to the Portuguese community last year.
My name is Jean Brune. I was the mayor of Somerville for 10 years, 1980 to 1990. Before then, I was the alderman for 6 years, all through the 70s. I was on the Board of Aldermen the first day that they turned on cable for the aldermen's meetings. So I know what has been taking place throughout the past 17 years on cable. During the time that I was mayor, I had to sign a contract for 10 years. We had to fight on a daily basis to try to get what was really ours. Because the problem is, you're a giant, you eat the small people. And when you're king of the forest, you kill the small animals. And that's what the cable companies are trying to do to us all the time. They want higher rates and less service. It took months of negotiations for me to get the fire station in Union Square into a cable center. It took months for me to get the proper billing. It took months for me to make sure that they got proper service when you had no service. All of these things take long negotiations because they don't care, because they have lots of money. With us, we had to use the resources of the city to constantly fight them. But if we won to a certain extent, and it benefit the people of Somerville, and then it continued to benefit the people of the other communities, because we had a contract in Somerville that was better than any other Warner Cable contract in the district. So then the other cities learned by it. My people fought Warner Cable so much that I was asked to testify in Boston, and I was asked to testify in Washington on the service that cable was giving us, and along with their rates that they were charging us too much money. You have a battle here this evening. A couple of things I'd like to tell you about. The stronger you stay together, the stronger you'll be. You can't divide.
Hi, welcome back to the studio. I'm Jean Flanagan, and we're here at Somerville Community Access Television. And we're talking about the new regulation that's going to come, that they're looking at for federal regulation about community access and access in general, with the telephone companies coming into the cable regulations. And that was former Mayor Brune talking to the Portuguese community about their personal fight about getting a Portuguese station. And their whole thing was that the Portuguese government was actually putting this television piece out there for anyone in the whole world. So it was about them allotting a channel. It wasn't going to cost money. Mm-hmm. And that was their big fight. And one of the things that they did in that was turn in all their boxes.
Well, that's the kind of thing that a franchise can put pressure on the cable company to provide their citizens with what they want. If we have a national franchise, it's going to be very difficult to petition Verizon, say, to put a certain program onto cable. But I think that tape really demonstrates how much people really depend on cable as a communication form, especially people who are immigrants and want to see news from their home country. Here at SCAT, the immigrant community, especially the Haitian community, is very active producing programming here. Every Saturday night they produce live shows because it's the only local video programs that they have in Creole.
Right.
And so the immigrant community is very dependent on public access. And it's really a shame that the media hasn't explained this bill to people, because I think people would be very upset if they really understood it. But it's kind of complicated. It's not like a soundbite type of discussion.
Well, I guess one of my questions is, as we look at our news, if we go away from cable and television for a moment and say, okay, they're in cahoots on this whole bill, so they don't want to say much about it. But, you know, all the local newspapers are owned by one company. And so they're not saying much about it. So, you know, if you're not actually involved in an access station, I'm not hearing anything about this bill.
Right. I mean, there's been very little in terms of, well, let's back up for 1 second, and let's just say, not that I'm trying to defend the larger media picture, because
Right.
I'm not, but the bill right now has come out of the Commerce Committee on the House side. It was introduced by Barton, Markey, and several others. Markey is the senior Democratic person on that committee, on the Commerce Committee. He fought very hard to have various parts of this bill modified, and that coalition fell apart several months ago, or a month and a half ago. But in any case, the bill's status at this point is that it has really been coming through the House, through the Commerce Committee. It was given a number recently. In fact, Wendy's the one who told me it's 5252. It's been known as the COPE bill. And don't ask me what the acronym for COPE is, because I just can't think of what it is. But it's probably, you know, competitive, da-da-da.
Right.
But so the bill is still in very formative stages. It's not like we have a piece of legislation that has been really actually formed.
Okay.
It's still, there's another bill that Senator Stevens is introducing in the Senate side, because, you know, as a bill, something comes through Congress, something comes through Senate,
yeah.
then it goes to markup. It can be reviewed by various committees, and we're hoping that the House bill will get snagged into Judiciary, because there's another facet that I think is really important besides the public access provisions that are that we've talked about, and that is called network neutrality. Right now, we all have access to the internet. We can all build websites. People can be involved in something like MoveOn.org that has grown enormously since its beginnings, a little bit pre the Iraq War, but it really made its presence known to millions and millions of people for its activism around organizing and protesting our entering into the Iraq War. It has moved on to be a very proactive tool. And I'm saying a lot about MoveOn.org. There's Free Press. There are various Common Cause. There are various different organizations like this that have become very web-based in what they're doing. And network neutrality allows the growth of this kind of thing. Craigslist, if you've ever used it. There are a lot of different things that we're beginning to use the web for that really serve us well in terms of information, in terms of buying and selling, renting, so forth.
Right.
What the telephone companies and the cable companies really actually are aligned with is wanting to stop that, wanting to have the web actually be managed by your telephone companies or your cable companies, beginning to they can then decide according to your fee structure how much of a pipe you get. So therefore, when you buy into a large pipe, like maybe a Yahoo does, or you know, AOL would provide, you get access to certain things. And so what they're basically doing is looking at chop up. If we lose network neutrality, we lose the ability for all of us to have similar access to the web, and you would have to pay more. I mean, I have visions of I would have free minutes after 7 o'clock. Does this ring a bell, you know, the way in which services have been sort of chopped up into something that makes it almost impossible to even know what your service is. That's what they're looking at. Exactly. And that's what they're looking at doing for the web. And the key term about that, to fight it, is to protect network neutrality. We want those to stay neutral and a public place where commerce and all things can take place. That's embedded in this bill as well. So we have a lot of people who are very actively involved and concerned about this bill because of what it's going to do, could do to the web.
And there's another aspect of the bill that's very troublesome, and that is redlining. The telephone company doesn't want to have to promise that they will wire the whole city. So if there are low income of Boston that might not be as lucrative to wire, they want to say we don't have to wire them, which kind of goes against their statement that they want to increase competition, because what they're doing is saying we want to increase competition, but only in places where we can make more money. For the other people, we don't care about competition. And it's really terrible because they don't have those people who are in this area won't have the option of having Verizon. If Verizon is going to be providing better service or cheaper rates or whatever, they won't have that.
They won't.
Now cable companies have to wire the whole city.
The whole city. Okay, so that's become a regulation.
And that is beginning to be looked at as a civil rights issue. I mean, if there's anything that will exacerbate the digital divide, it is allowing, because, you know, once the telephone companies can do something, the cable companies will be quickly behind them in terms of they're not going to fall under certain constraints that are not, their competition is not. So you know there'll be court battles about it and so forth. But basically, this bill is flawed not only from the PEG access point of view, but from the network neutrality in terms of, and from, as Wendy says, the build-out is the term that is used in terms of requiring a provider to provide the entire community with service. And we saw this happen in terms of broadband being spun out. You know, There were places that got broadband very early on and had it, and there are places in this country that still don't have access to it.
Right.
The same thing with DSL lines. I mean, I do focus groups all over the country in the work that I do, and one of the things that frustrates a lot of different places is that they aren't getting services that the community next door might be getting, or that their children over in DC are getting, or whatever.
Right.
This bill would allow that to become actually legal.
Yeah, I know up in rural communities, I know streets up in New Hampshire where they've run DSL halfway down a street because there are houses on both sides of the street, and then they stopped at that intersection. Didn't go, it's not that they forked and turned somewhere else, they just stopped there. Because after that, the houses are half as dense.
Right. And usually in a contract, that those are called build-out requirements, and so they do enter into that in the contract. They do state, you know, after the density of population becomes, you know, less than 25 homes per mile, then they enter into, the residents will have to pay into building out the system. I mean, some of that rural stuff is still a problem, but it's at least in regulation where you know what the
There's a
going
way
in.
to create
This will
it.
be driven by market values only.
Right.
So that is the piece that hopefully will slow down this bill, because it's being looked at as a civil rights issue. If it's a civil rights issue, then this bill has to go to the Judiciary Committee, which could in fact slow the whole process of getting this bill passed enough to maybe not have the bill come together in this legislative session. There's two things that are happening there. One is we have elections coming up in November. So, you know, as a giveaway, this whole cadre of people want to see this bill as soon as possible, because if there's a change in the House, there could be a change in the power to be able to give away to the telephone companies, the telcos, to the level at which this bill would. So there's a push on some levels for it to get through. There's a drag on other levels. We can slow it down and possibly kill the bill.
Now, people might say, well, why is this bill making such headway if it's so bad? I mean, what is pushing this bill? And we have to say, well, Verizon is paying millions and millions of dollars into Congress to lobby this bill. This is
Huge.
Right.
huge amounts of
deals
money.
are being made.
Right.
Huge amounts of money, and it makes us feel, you know, like we don't have much impact when so much money is changing hands. But I think that grassroots are very powerful, and if we can hold it off until the end of the elections, maybe we have a better chance of slowing it down, or at least putting some democratic provisions into it, because the House Judiciary Committee decided not to negotiate with Democrats on this bill. They wanted to make it a partisan bill, and Markey then got cut out of the negotiations. And perhaps if the Democrats have more power, more balance, maybe we'll see some better provisions.
So waiting to getting it to not pass before
Yes.
November
Kill
is
the
the
bill
first.
is one piece.
It's
That's
one.
I'm giving you the phraseology. When you read it in the newspaper and you think about network neutrality, at least you have a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about network neutrality. It means having everyone have access to the internet and not chopping it up in all those little things that, you know, drive crazy in terms of packages. When we talk about build out, we're talking about requiring that a company that comes in and uses public property provide service to all of the residents of that community, not just where it's lucrative. And then the other parts of PEG, of course, public education and government access we've talked about.
Okay. I want to go to our last tape, and it's our former executive director here at SCAT talking about the previous negotiation work that we did in our last set of negotiations, part of which allowed us to go digital, and we have a digital control room and digital feedback. It improves a lot of things. It improves performance. Can put their shows on. Really changed how our station looks and works and how people can get on air. So let's just look and see. Mimi just talks a little short about how hard the community works to negotiate.
Well, at the public hearing, Paul Train, who's the director of the Office of Communications for the city, basically expressed the administration's policy of that they are supportive of the 3 PEG access channels. They are going for the maximum allowable franchise fee of 5% of the gross revenues, which is a similar agreement to what's with Time Warner. And sort of keeping with the level playing field concepts, that they're going for a similar agreement they had with Time Warner. The city funds SCAT equivalent to 1.57 of Warner's gross revenues, and it would be a similar deal with what's happening with RCN should that franchise fee be agreed to.
So how much money is that in a year?
Last year was $121,000. Is a little less than it's about a little less than a third of SCAT's total operating budget. The rest we do fundraising for. Under the Time Warner contract that was signed in '92, SCAT received $300,000 to last us for the next 10 years worth of video equipment. So spread over, when you think of our initial outlay just to upgrade some of the systems, was about half of that budget. So we've really only got $150,000 to last us. And when you look at how much the price of one deck at, $6,000, $7,000 at a pop, the money goes quite quickly. And as part of this RCN contract, the city is not interested in going for public access equipment, that they're looking for something of equivalent value. Of course, from our perspective, we'd like that to go towards public access because of some of the things we're talking about of this digital convergence. Digital systems, it's meaning that we're going to have to overhaul things quite quickly. And not only are we dealing with the ongoing care of equipment that gets a lot of use, but we're dealing with needing to upgrade it to whole new systems, so that where we might have been able to scramble and put a couple pieces together, we're needing to look at a whole new system because things aren't going to be compatible anymore. So that's where the city's.
Hi, and welcome back. What we want to do in the of our show, talking about the new at the federal level, is to talk about what the state level involvement is, and
well, there is Verizon is and the telco. I'm just going to say telcos as telephone companies.
The telephone companies
aren't stopping at what their prospects are on the national level. They're also in states across this country looking to get regulation passed state by state by state. And there has been a I don't know exactly what you call it when it's submitted to the state, but a proposal, let's call it. There's another word for it, to the department, the DTE, which is the Department of Transportation and Education? No,
Telecommunications and Energy.
Telecommunications and Energy, which would actually exacerbate that same thing of wanting to be able to get a franchise through days, so that the process which they would be able to get their contracts. Well, it's 30 days to submit it, and then 60 days following it. So anyway, what that window is they're tightening that window, and anyone who's ever worked on any of these franchise agreements knows that it is sort of like it's not going to happen. Public hearings, negotiations, all of these things. That language has now been put out by the DTE, and comments, which is what people can do, which is they can write to the DTE and make comments on the legislation. You can go to the website and you'll find a description from the DTE of pending rulings. Rulings, that's what it was. And look at those rulings, and then up until July 13th, I think, they're accepting comments on them. And then, of course, there's another window until September of their reading and returning information back from those rulings, from those comments.
And what's the website?
It's the Department of Telecommunications and Energy. At the Commonwealth website.
At the
Commonwealth.
At the Commonwealth.
In Massachusetts.
Okay.
No, another thing that Verizon is doing, or the telcos are doing around the is trying to get statewide franchises, because before they could get the national one, they were in a hurry. And so, for example, in Texas, they've done away with local franchises, and now they have a statewide Texas franchise. It's another way of short-circuiting the local control.
And has that been around long enough for us to know how that's affected Texas?
No, I think these things are all attacks that have been happening in the last year.
Okay.
So it's really hard to see how that sifts out and how it affects then, because we're talking about telephone, not talking about the reaction that's going to happen as a consequence to it with a cable. So, you know, there's a lot that's going to play itself out, but what we're looking at right now is that we have to have a population in this country that stops and that thinks about the concept of governance and the concept of public interest set-asides by these embedded in these policies. And it cannot be just a giveaway to corporations and then that letting the market bear, you know, what might be.
I want to have you repeat an analogy that you said before we came on air, referring to the whole public governance and talking about just the historically using public land. You use public lands as the analogy.
Well, I used to try to wake people up. I've been doing this now for 30 years, so I've been in many a city hall, and they glaze over when you're talking telephone or you're talking cable or whatever. So I said, well,
we just need it.
Well, you know, and what I used to say was, look, way back when, turn of the last century, there were people who came and who were very actively involved in saying, let's put land aside for public use. Let's have commons, let's have parks, let's have national parks, let's have state parks. And they were all looked at as sort of a radical, extremist, progressive, whatever, dismissed, marginalized group of people who wanted to see some part of this vast land protected. What I'm saying to a city father today is, or mother, is you can't see what we're talking about, but we need to have set-asides put in place for the public interest in our telecommunications landscape. When we were trying to protect property, there was so much land around, they thought we were crazy. When you come in to start to talk about it today, they see so much telecommunications of every kind, the web and cell phones and so forth. They can't imagine that there is a real vital need to put some public interest principles in place so that some parts of those things are protected. That's what American public needs to wake up to, because once we lose them, like a park, like the space that could be, once we lose those, you don't get them back. And these channels are worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. And in today's regulation, every community should have them. And not getting them is just an incredible bad lack of future vision.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Rika, and thank you, Wendy. It's been great. And for those of you that those of you in Somerville, just remember, Somerville at the turn of the century was the most densely populated community in the country, and because no public set aside. So let's make sure public access is set aside. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.